The radios did not sound confused. That is what makes this moment more dangerous, not less. The crews on the northern line knew exactly what was happening. Inbound tracks, engagement windows, intercept attempts, fallback channels. The system was not collapsing because nobody understood the drill. The system was collapsing because the drill had finally met a volume of force it was never designed to absorb forever. That is the first thing to understand about what happened over northern Israel. This was not panic. It was arithmetic. And once you see it that way, the entire story changes. The headline says 300 missiles. The headline says 5 brigades destroyed. The headline says ceasefire pressure. All of that matters, but it is still one layer too shallow. The real story is that a defensive architecture sold for years as the answer to a strategic problem has just revealed its upper boundary in public combat. The missiles did not merely hit targets, they exposed a ceiling, and once that ceiling becomes visible, everything built politically, militarily, and psychologically above it starts to lose altitude. That is the axis of this story. Not the missiles by themselves, not the damage by itself, the exposure of the ceiling for years. Israel invested in the most sophisticated layered missile defense system available to any American ally, Iron Dome, for one layer, David Sling for another arrow for the upper tier, technically serious, heavily funded, repeatedly refined. But no matter how advanced the shield, a shield still lives inside limits. Magazine depth, reload time, radar processing, engagement sequencing, interceptor allocation, and the unavoidable burden of simultaneity. When a defender faces a salvo large enough and smart enough to exceed those linked limits across a compressed window, the question is no longer whether the shield exists. The question is whether the shield can keep pace with the problem it was built to solve. That is why the strike matters so much more than the average war update. Iran did not just prove it can fire missiles. Every state in this region already knew Iran could do that. What it proved, if the account in this mother document is taken on its own terms, is that it can structure a strike around the exact point where the defensive system becomes saturated. That is a different category of signal. It says the target was not merely northern Israel. The target was the equation itself. And if that reading is even mostly correct, then the event is not tactical first. It is strategic first. Think about what Northern Command represents. It is not simply another headquarters marker on a map. It is the operating brain behind Israel's northern military posture, the place where brigades, logistics, communications, relay nodes, air defense coordination, and operational decisions are stitched into one working machine. Once you understand that, you also understand why the destruction of 5 brigades must be interpreted carefully. Destroyed is not a cinematic word here. It is an organizational word. It means the structure that turns armed personnel into combat formations was broken badly enough that the formation as a formation ceased to function. That is a much more serious thing than local damage. A battalion can absorb casualties and keep fighting. A brigade can lose hardware and still reorganize. But when command posts, communications, logistics, relay architecture, and decision flow are smashed together, you do not just wound a force, you switch off its coherence. From the outside, soldiers may still be present, equipment may still exist, vehicles may still move, but the force has crossed from organized military instrument into tactical fragmentation. That is what makes the phrase 5 brigades destroyed so heavy. It is not the body count implied by the word. It is the loss of organized function. Now we get to the part that is even more uncomfortable for Washington and Tel Aviv. If such a result took shape inside a theater protected by decades of American money, American engineering, American doctrine, and American political guarantees, then the problem cannot be explained away as a temporary glitch. Temporary glitches do not produce strategic aftershocks like this. Strategic aftershocks come when a system collides with a threat model it did not fully absorb in time. This is where the Khaybar Shikan matters. Not because it is magic, not because Iran has suddenly leapt into some new category of invincibility. It matters because every serious feature attributed to the weapon in the source points in one direction. Range, terminal behavior, guidance logic, warhead design, and attack sizing all appear aimed at one objective: build a missile, not against abstract enemies, but against the specific defensive architecture the enemy spent years fielding. That is a very different development philosophy from the one Western commentary often assigns to sanctioned states. It assumes testing, patience, iteration, engineering, feedback, and above all, strategic clarity. In plain English, it assumes Iran spent years building the answer to a test Israel and America thought they were setting for everyone else. This is why the deeper failure here is institutional before it is operational. Operationally, you can explain this night through interception, math, and target allocation. Institutionally, You have to explain why so much of the strategic establishment kept acting as if a sanctioned adversary would remain trapped beneath a technological ceiling that the available evidence suggested it had been climbing for years. That is not a small error. That is the kind of error that shapes procurement cycles, intelligence weighting, diplomatic assumptions, and the Public Confidence Leaders Project. And public confidence matters because deterrence lives partly inside belief if allied publics, regional partners, and adversaries all watch a strike package tear through the northern military architecture of Israel and then watch ceasefire pressure rise immediately afterward. They draw conclusions whether official briefings want them to or not. Those conclusions travel fast, faster than replacement missiles, faster than congressional funding, faster than a carefully worded Pentagon statement. That is why this event widens so quickly beyond Israel. For Israel, the choice tree narrows almost immediately. It can replenish interceptors and ask for more. That is necessary. But necessary is not the same as decisive. It can intensify strikes in hopes of restoring deterrence through punishment. That may impose costs. But it also pushes directly into the retaliatory web Iran built precisely to make escalation more expensive with every rung, or it can move towards ceasefire logic, publicly dressed as prudence, privately driven by the recognition that the current trajectory is worse than the language used to justify it. None of those options is clean. That matters. The same is true for Washington. Washington can speed up intelligence sharing, resupply, and diplomatic backing. It will. But the real hinge question lies elsewhere. Is the United States willing to take direct action against the broader infrastructure that generated this capability? Not in theory, in reality. Under present political constraints, under present regional risk, under present market sensitivity, under present escalation logic that is a much narrower lane than public rhetoric suggests. Because Iran did not spend years building missiles in isolation, it built a whole deterrent environment around them. Hormuz pressure, regional retaliation, proxy thresholds, economic consequences. Escalation branches designed to make American policymakers stop, not at the question, can we do more, but at the more dangerous question, what chain do we trigger if we do? A great power can possess more capability than its rival and still find itself strategically constrained. That is not weakness. It is the normal condition of modern deterrence, but institutions hate admitting it after a shock. And yet this is exactly the moment where admission matters most. Because if the lesson drawn from this night is merely buy more interceptors, then the next round will teach the same lesson at higher cost. More interceptors matter. They are not irrelevant. But this event, as presented by the source, is not just a munitions story. It is a competition between fixed defensive assumptions and an adversary that kept designing itself around those assumptions until the gap became visible. That is why Russia and China both matter, even when they are not firing the missiles. Russia studies the military lesson, how a saturated ballistic package can overwhelm layered defense and paralyze command architecture. China studies the geopolitical lesson, how moments of American embarrassment create room for diplomatic brokerage, regional repositioning, and the slow expansion of influence without direct war. Gulf states study yet another lesson. If the strongest shield in the neighborhood has an exposed upper limit, then every security calculation made under that shield has to be reopened. The shock does not stay local, it migrates. And this is exactly why the event has such consequence in strategic terms. A visible ceiling changes behavior far beyond the place where it was seen. The biggest mistake now would be to shrink the story into a single night of violence. That would be comforting. It would also be false. This night is the visible edge of a much longer argument about technology, adaptation, institutional learning, and the danger of assuming that a shield is permanent simply because it has worked long enough to become part of political common sense. Political common sense is often the last thing to update. That is why shocks matter. Shocks strip away the comfort language that lets institutions postpone reckoning. Once the strike has landed, once the brigades are no longer functioning as brigades, once the Northern Command picture has been forced into emergency mode, the old phrases sound thinner: manageable threat, credible deterrence, escalation dominance, secure architecture. Those phrases do not vanish. But after a night like this, they no longer sound like conclusions. They sound like defenses against conclusion. And that is where the most important question finally appears. Not whether Iran can build capability. That question has answered itself. Not whether Israel can fight. It clearly can. Not whether the United States remains military power. It does. The real question is whether the institutions on the American side can absorb the lesson without first watering it down into something safer, smaller, and less disruptive. Can they admit that the problem was not only tactical surprise, but years of strategic underreading? Can they build policy around the world as it is, not around the world their own frameworks kept insisting should still exist? That is the question this strike leaves behind. And if that question is not answered honestly, then the next engagement will arrive carrying not just missiles, but the added weight of a lesson everyone already saw and nobody important wanted to learn. Missiles do damage, visible ceilings do something worse. They change what everyone thinks is possible.